Hello everyone and welcome. Today we are going to talk about and rank all of the lunar items in Risk of Rain 2. This is the only category of items left to rank, and it was left to last because some of these items are wildly powerful, and some of them are just straight dog water. So hopefully today's list will be exciting. Really quickly before we begin, I would just like to remind everybody that liking and subscribing are both greatly appreciated. They tell me that you like my content, and they tell YouTube that they should show my content to more people. But without further ado, let's jump into the video. We're going to start off the list with the Beads of Fealty, which is easily going into the S tier. This item is S tier because it does absolutely nothing but unlock an alternate ending, which means there's never a problem picking it up. In my opinion, the alternate ending itself isn't very exciting, and it can't even be accessed on Eclipse, but you know, if you want a final boss fight that isn't Mithrix, there you go. Plus, every Beads of Fealty is a potential Irradiant Pearl, if you find the cleansing pool anyway, so honestly, not a terrible item. Next up we have the Brittle Crown, which is going into our A tier. The Brittle Crown can be pretty powerful, especially on pre-looping runs. Being able to generate gold out of thin air instead of killing monsters can really accelerate each stage, and the value of that should not be understated. At the same time though, the value of this item scales directly with individual skill. The more damage that you take, the less value you get out of this item. So it's not something I would recommend to someone who plays the game a little more casually. If you're an Eclipse 8 sweaty gamer like me though, consider picking this up. Corpse Bloom is our next item, and honestly this isn't too bad. If you're running a healing build with Nukahana's Opinion as your main damage source, this can actually give you a pretty sizable bump in damage. Only at one stack though. The rate of healing reduction that is increased when you stack this item is tremendous. At even 2 stacks, all of your healing is likely going to come in far too slow for your Nukahanas to do damage. And likewise, even if you're not stacking healing, if your effective heal per second is greater than 5% of your maximum health, then you're just shooting yourself in the foot by taking 2 of them. In conclusion, one of them, not too bad, especially if you're stacking healing. More than one, pretty useless. So it's going to go into the C tier. Defiant Gouges is up next, and the best I can say is this is an organic way to make your game more difficult. Having higher difficulty monsters pop up whenever you use a shrine can potentially help with gold income, if that were an issue, but for the most part I think just swamps you with enemies when you're trying to use a Shrine of Chance over and over again. And to be honest, I can't really see a use for it aside from that. If you want an extra challenge, go for it. Otherwise, this is staying in the D tier. The Ego is our next item on the list, and this one is easily going into the S tier. With enough stacks, this item can actually just be all of your damage. It can solo the game for you, but the real strength of this item comes in once you start looping. Once you start getting items much more quickly than the Ego can take it away, you start gaining the benefit of the interplay between these items. Ego gives you a bunch of strong hits with 1.0 proc coefficients, and sitting on even one ATG or Polyloot means your damage starts to skyrocket pretty quickly. And it's worth mentioning also that this item is leagues better on any melee survivor because they are naturally going to be in range of the balls. Mercenary, Acrid, and Loader want to be right up next to the enemy a lot of the time, so they're going to get full value out of the Ego even when it's at only a few stacks. Commando, Captain, and Railgunner on the other hand like to use their range to their advantage, and they require many more stacks of Ego to work at their effective range. Although to be honest, if you're looping enough, that's not even a big deal. You'll get so many bombs that you'll have plenty of range and plenty of damage. Essence of Heresy is our next item on the list, and this is one of our 4 special heretic items. Getting this in combination with the other 3 unlocks the Secret Survivor Heretic. And honestly, I really like the Essence of Heresy. I think Ruin is a great special skill. I think it eclipses many of the normal survivors' special skills actually. If you're playing a survivor like Commando or Huntress, who land a lot of hits very quickly, Ruin can amp their damage a lot, especially because it provides a very strong way to proc bans. And even on some other survivors like Captain and Bandit, if you have a Polyloot or Plasma Shrimp leading to a bunch of extra hits, Ruin can be a very consistent way to amp damage for them too, and for Bandit, even without farming enemies. So for me, this one's going to go into the A tier. Eulogy 0 on the other hand is going into the D tier. I think this item is pretty bad. In my opinion, what makes a lot of these lunars useful at all is the fact that you get to pick which ones you get. Going to the bazaar gives you 5 options, and you can pick and choose from those options, plus having a reroll on them that allows you to boost your build with lunars however you want. Eulogy takes that away from you, and a lot of these items are just not worth picking up, or even if they are worth picking up, you don't want too many of them. So I would say this item is never worth picking up, unless there's a cleansing pool on the same stage. Focus Convergence is up next, and this is going to go to the top of B tier. This particular item can be incredibly helpful on Monsoon and below. The issue comes from playing on Eclipse 2+, where teleporter range is halved. On Eclipse 2 and above, even having one Focus Convergence can make doing the pillars on commencement basically impossible, and can make normal teleporter events pretty painful unless you have so many items that the enemies are dying before they spawn. I think if you know you're going to be looping a lot, picking these up might be worth it anyway, because you can cut down on a lot of time based on how many times you're going to be in a teleporter event. Plus, if you're looping, you're probably going to have so many items that the game is starting to play itself anyway. But if you're not looping, probably not worth picking it up. Gestures, on the other hand, are some of the strongest items in the entire game. If you watched my equipment item tier list, then you know that I think equipment are some of the strongest items in the game. It's basically picking your 5th skill, and a lot of those 5th skills are wildly powerful. For the most part, gestures just make it better. There are a couple that require precise aim, and for those, gestures can be a little annoying because you have to keep track of the cooldown, but for the vast majority it's pretty fire and forget, and having an extra 50% cooldown along with an automatic activation boosts their power immensely, not to mention lowering your mental stack, giving you one less thing to have to pay attention to. This item is so powerful that if I were recommending one single strategy to help people get through the higher Eclipse levels, I would say go to the new altar and pick up some gestures. Easy S tier. Hooks of Heresy is our next Heretic tier item, and this one's also going into the A tier. Much like Ruin, Slicing Maelstrom is a pretty strong upgrade for a lot of survivors. Captain in particular, who has one of the worst M2s in the entire game, benefits immensely from having Slicing Maelstrom, but it's not bad on most survivors. The only two I would 100% avoid picking this up on are Railgunner and Loader, because their M2s are integral to their kit. For everyone else, even if they do have a decent M2, Slicing Maelstrom is probably a side grade for them. Light Flux Pauldron, on the other hand, is going into the D tier. This item is garbage. It might sound fun to have 50% reduced cooldown in exchange for attack speed, because there are survivors who prefer cooldown reduction to attack speed. Artificer, Acrid, and Loader are examples of these. However, even these survivors have attack speed scaling, because attack speed regulates how fast your moves activate. For Loader and Artificer in particular, attack speed is even more important because it regulates how fast their M2 and utilities respectively charge. Having a 50% longer charge time lowers their DPS uptime significantly, and even on survivors like Mercenary, who might ostensibly like having higher cooldown in exchange for attack speed, really don't, because skilled Mercenary players will be activating Expose frequently, and he can't do that with low attack speed. And similarly, Eviscerate, his special, scales with attack speed, so you'll maybe be hitting enemies twice with it after picking this up. So I would say this is one of the worst lunar items, and to never pick this up on any survivor. Next on the list is the Mercurialrakis, which isn't terrible, but has the potential to screw you over. The real issue is that the zones of increased damage that it creates are placed randomly, which means they can be put in a position that exclusively benefits the enemies and not you, for example, outside of a teleporter range. With that said though, it's not incredibly difficult to play around the circles, and I would say if you're really going for an Irradiant Pearl, this isn't a terrible pickup. Compared to the lunars that are actually good though, this is pretty atrocious, and it's gonna go in the C tier. Next is the Purity, which is a bit of an interesting item because it does have some use. The question that you should be asking yourself when you want to pick up the Purity is whether or not your character's synergy with cooldown reduction is better than item synergies. I think for the most part the answer is probably no. Characters like Huntress, Commando, and Captain can proc a lot of items really quickly, which means that their ability to start proc chains is quite high. Characters like Acrid, Mercenary, and even Loader though, who have much more cooldown based playstyles, can find some use from this item though. The only thing to keep in mind is that if you do pick this up, all of the items that are based off of chance will no longer be useful for you. And that means high tier items like tri-tip daggers, lensmaker's glasses, ATGs, and ukuleles. So if you are planning on picking this up, it pays to prioritize items that do not have a proc chance, like the Kiaro's and Runald's bands, the Plasma Shrimp, and the Chrono Bauble. So while you can create effective builds with it, I still don't think it could go any higher than B tier, just because item synergies by themselves are so strong. Next is the Shaped Glass, which is one of my favorites. As far as I'm concerned, more damage equals more better, because remember, an enemy that's already dead can't kill you. I would say if you're confident in your ability to not get hit, whether that means individual skill or just the amount of move speed items you've picked up, Shaped Glass is never a bad thing. Getting more of them can make your trip through stages and even fighting bosses much easier. With enough damage, you can just one-shot Mithrix in the Voidling. So for me, easy S tier. The Stone Flux Pauldron, on the other hand, is easy D tier. I said this in the white item tier list, but in my opinion, movement speed is the most important defensive item in Risk of Rain 2. Being able to consistently dodge attacks and go through stages more quickly is invaluable, and the Stone Flux Pauldron cuts that in half. The only time I can ever see this item being used is if you're too fast. If you somehow manage to stack 200 goat hooves, whether through a Shrine of Order or otherwise, Stoneflux Pauldron can help return control to your character, where it was once uncontrollable. But other than that, I think this item is never worth it. Movement speed is too valuable to be giving up for something as paltry as 100% extra health. Strides of Heresy is going into the A tier, as this is our third heretic item. Shadow Fade is actually incredibly strong on its own, and for survivors that don't have mobility like Captain or Rex, this can be a godsend. And not only does it provide mobility, it provides invincibility, light, and healing. Honestly, just very strong. There are some survivors like Huntress and Acrid that really like their utility abilities, and for them I would not recommend picking this up. But on most survivors, it's a side grade at worst. It's just a very strong ability. So it goes into the A tier. Transcendence is our last S tier lunar item. In several of my tier lists I've mentioned how I think healing is really bad. Not just on Eclipse 5+, where healing value is halved, but even on Monsoon and below. I just think the value on it isn't very good. And Transcendence lets you get rid of all of those healing items, unless you are specifically trying to go for a healing synergy, like with Nuka-Hanas and Aegis. Getting a Transcendence early in the run means you don't have to worry about picking up any Wungus, Cautious Slugs, or medkits for the rest of the run. And on top of that, because it leaves you with exactly 1 health, it makes you functionally immune to fall damage, removing the Eclipse 3 modifier for that level and any subsequent levels. So in my opinion, this item is always worth picking up on every single survivor. It's just never bad. The only caveat I will mention is that if you are going for a healing based build, be wary of any items that heal based off of percentage health. Items like the Bungus, or equipment like the Foreign Fruit, will only heal off of that exactly 1 health that you're left with after taking the Transcendence, making them basically useless. But other than that, even Nuka-Hana's opinion continues to function like normal, actually at a benefit because Transcendence increases health by 50%, so even then, worth picking up. The last non-equipment lunar item that we're going to talk about is the Visions of Heresy, our last heretic item. This one is also going into the A tier. It's pretty good. There are some survivors that have better or more consistent M1s, like Huntress, Captain, and Commando, But for some survivors, specifically Acrid and Engineer, this is an invaluable pickup. Engineer's M1 is terrible, and replacing the turret's M1 with visions isn't bad either. Likewise, Acrid only benefits from having a ranged M1, as opposed to someone like Mercenary, who needs his M1 to proc expose. Among the survivors where it's more of a side grade, like Artificer and Rex, you're going to have to put in a little more thought for whether you want to pick this up. But even on them, not awful. So while it might be overall the worst of the heresy items across the survivors, I still think it is quite strong and usually worth picking up. Moving on to the lunar equipments, we're starting with the Effigy of Grief, which is going to go into the C tier. Honestly, this item isn't terrible. Having the ability to place down a universal slow and armor reducing field can make fighting bosses and even Mithrix pretty easy. You do have to be careful with where you put it down though, because that slow and armor reduction also affects you and your allies. But if you're careful, this equipment can actually benefit you pretty well. The glowing meteorite on the other hand is going into the D tier. The only thing this is good for is for team killing in multiplayer. Honestly, as far as damaging equipment goes, it's not terrible on the damage it does, but because the blasts are random, it's inconsistent, and because those blasts can hurt you, it is doubly inconsistent. Taking a glowing meteorite with a few gestures has the potential to end your run by itself. So I would never recommend picking this up unless you're actually looking to kill your friends. Hellfire Tincture on the other hand is going into the B tier. The damage it does on its own is not incredible without a lot of health stacking, but where this item really shines is its ability to proc Razor Wire consistently. On Monsoon and below, self-damage builds with a Hellfire Tincture are pretty strong because you don't have to worry about the lower healing value from Eclipse 5 and up, or the permanent damage on Eclipse 8. However, even on those difficulties, if you have enough armor or damage block to mitigate the damage from this, you can take low enough damage that the Eclipse 8 permanent damage modifier won't even proc on yourself, meaning that this item can be helpful even on Eclipse. The reason I don't rate it higher then is just because it required so many items to be good. Repulsion armors, rose bucklers, gestures, and razor wires are all required to make this item good. And as an added downside, using a Hellfire Tincture in your build means that you can't use safer spaces, which is in my opinion the best defensive item in the entire game. So while it can be pretty good, it's going to have to go into the B tier. And finally we have the Spindle tonic, which has the potential to be the strongest equipment in the entire game, but only if you have enough gestures and fuel cells to make it a constant effect. Looking at the stats on this item, it's ridiculous. 100% damage, 70% attack speed, 20 armor, 50% health, more health regeneration, and more move speed. This equipment is ridiculous. But you have to make sure that the effect never wears off, otherwise you're going to get those tonic afflictions. As a counterpart to the gesture advice I gave earlier, I would say if you're having trouble with the higher eclipse levels, rushing a Spindle tonic build with gestures and fuel cells can make everything a lot easier. And the best part is, it's good on everybody, because it's not just attack speed but also straight damage. There is not a single survivor that doesn't benefit from this item. So with all of that glowing praise though, I'm still going to put it in the B tier, just because it's basically dead weight if you don't have enough gestures or fuel cells to make it permanent. But now I want to hear what you think. What are your opinions on the lunar items? Did I miss an aspect of one of these? Let me know in the comments below. Reading and responding to comments is one of my favorite parts of making these videos. Regardless, I hope all of you enjoyed watching, and I hope all of you have a wonderful day.